Okay, so we are moving on to Unit 2, Lesson 3. And this lesson is going to cover how, after the French and Indian War, the British government began to make major policy changes in colonial America. So, your lesson objective for today and this lesson is that you can explain how the British changed their policies towards their colonial subjects following the French and Indian War. You have three must dos for this lesson: the video and the guided notes. There's a graphic organizer analyzing each of the new British policies or laws. And then there is a should do as an ed puzzle. Okay, so first and foremost, I want you to consider this situation. So imagine this is real life right now, that it's announced that the cost of music, apps on your phone, or snacks like chips or candy will double immediately due to an increase in tax. Would you tolerate these changes? Meaning, would you be okay with them? And what do you think would push you over the edge in regards to these changes? What would make you so angry and so upset um, if something like this were to happen? So I want you to pause the video and take a moment in your guided notes to consider this discussion question. So, a couple of things to remember. So, up until the end of the French and Indian War that we just covered in lesson 2, Great Britain, for the most part, has had limited direct control over the 13 colonies. This is what we call salutary neglect. So, obviously, the British were passing laws, but they really weren't enforcing anything in the 13 colonies. So, for the people living in the 13 colonies, they felt as though the British government was kind of just letting them do whatever they want, as long as they were trading with them and sending goods to them economically. But after the war had cost a lot of money. So, they are in massive debt. So, the colonists need to start paying up. Up until this point, the colonists have experienced prosperity. They've made a lot of money. There's a lot of money to be had in the New World. And they've also had freedoms and liberties like governing themselves up until this point. But that's going to quickly change. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763, you'll remember from your last set of notes, the British passed the Proclamation of 1763, which closed the region west of the Appalachian Mountains to settlement. The reason for this is the British were trying to enforce their new territory that they had just gained from the French, and they didn't want colonists like getting into trouble with Native Americans taking Native American land. But the colonists thought, well, if this land that you see over here in the pink, okay, this salmon color, they assumed if it's British land and we're British subjects, then why can't we move into this territory? So very quickly, they become kind of annoyed by this proclamation. But there will be other changes that follow. Now, after 1763, the British begin to tax the colonists very highly in order to raise money. The first tax is kind of a small one, the Sugar Act. They tax colonists on imported sugar that were coming from the Caribbean. Um, in order to kind of protect the colonies after the French and Indian War, there were many soldiers that remained in the new 13 colonies. So they needed somewhere to live. So they passed what's called the Quartering Act. This required colonists to house British soldiers. Then we have another major tax act passed called the Townshend Acts. This allowed for taxation of more goods. Then you have the passage of the Stamp Act. This taxed most printed materials in the colonies. Each one of these is going to be an added cost to the colonists, and they're not going to be very happy about this. So, what do you do when you're not happy about something? You protest. You start to boycott maybe these goods that have taxes on them. A boycott means you don't purchase something because you don't want the tax to get paid. But the big straw that will break the camel's back, as they say, or really upset the colonists is going to be the Tea Act. So, how do the colonists react to these things? Not good. They protest, they boycott. And then after the Townshend Acts, many colonists begin to react violently. They attack soldiers in the streets. One city in particular that had a lot of protests happening was Boston in Massachusetts. Remember, a lot of these taxes are on things that are goods that are being brought into the colonies. Boston is a major port where a lot of these goods are shipped in and shipped out. So they will have to face the tax a lot more than maybe some other places would. So tensions are very high between the colonists and British soldiers that are in the colonies. So in 1770, on March 5th, a group of colonists kind of like start harassing British soldiers. At some point, shots are fired into a crowd of people, and 5 colonists are killed. This becomes branded or known as the Boston Massacre. And on the left-hand side, this is an engraving by Paul Revere. He's a famous Boston silversmith, also just kind of jack of all trades. This gets widely circulated around the colonies. So people kind of look at this image and say, oh my God, like this is terrible. Look at these soldiers. Look at this officer just firing, telling his soldiers to fire into the crowd. This probably isn't actually what happened, but this is what people in other colonies saw of the event when they read about it. They saw this picture. So this is really kind of a form of propaganda. You're going to think that the British are at fault. The British like did this horrible thing. The picture that you see on the right here, this is the old Massachusetts State House in Boston today. And you can see it here in the images in Paul Revere's picture. A couple of other photographs that I actually took myself. There's another picture of the State House. You can see this is in downtown Boston today. And on the right-hand side is the grave site where the 5 people killed are buried and remembered in Boston today as well. Okay, so there's a couple of other ways that the colonists respond. They get together a meeting to protest the Stamp Act. And at this meeting, they said, you know, it's not that we don't want to pay taxes. It's the fact that like we don't have a say in any of the laws being placed. So their big battle cry was that they don't want taxation without representation. Then, after the passage of the Tea Act, you have the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where the colonists dress up as Native Americans and boarded tea ships and dumped the tea into Boston Harbor. So, as a response to that, all this money that was lost for the British passed what's known as the Intolerable Acts, meaning like could not be tolerated. This was a terrible thing, which put even more restrictions on the colonists, but the big thing is they close Boston Harbor. So again, if your major way of importing things, making money is through the harbor, closing Boston Harbor to shipments is going to be a huge blow to the people of Boston. So as a result of that, there is the Continental Congress that joined. This was made up of representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies. They travel to Philadelphia and they try to figure out, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about these policy changes, about these soldiers, about these tensions? So the major things they decide at the moment are, first things first, we're going to boycott British goods. We're going to form militias, which is a form of defense. There's no like police officers, there's no military unless it's the British soldiers. So they're like, let's prepare in case it comes to the fact that we might need to fight for our independence. And then the last thing they do at the First Continental Congress is lay out a list of things that upset them to King George III. So they're hoping to hear back from the king. They're hoping that the king is going to say, you know what, you're right. You know, let's consider letting you guys have representation. Let's consider, you know, repealing some of the taxes. But before that can happen, shots will be fired to begin the revolution. So what ideas were behind the revolution? The idea of the Enlightenment. You might remember learning about the Enlightenment in world history. There were all these new thinkers that promoted these ideas, like John Locke promoting natural laws, which is basically rights that you have simply because you're a human being. We have Thomas Paine, who publishes a pamphlet, basically an essay called Common Sense. And in Common Sense, think of it as like a persuasive essay where he persuades supporting a violent break from Great Britain. So then in April 1775, the British troops had heard that the people of Boston and the people of Massachusetts had begun to stockpile some weapons. So they planned to march from Boston to Concord to destroy their supplies. There was gunpowder, guns, cannons. But the colonists find out that the British are moving. So Paul Revere takes his midnight ride to warn Americans and warn the people of Lexington and Concord that the British were about to attack. When the British reach Lexington, they encounter a group of men that are armed, and someone fires shots, and that becomes the first battle of the Revolution, the shot heard around the world. So basically now at this point, all of these policies and changes have now taken us to revolution. So consider, what would be making the colonists so mad to get to this point. Your Ed puzzle is going to cover a little bit more about the rise in tensions to that point. Again, remember, finish your guided notes, and then you're going to work on the graphic organizer that appears here. Okay, so I filled out, these are all the different laws that are passed by the colonists. You're going to tell me what it did, how did the colonists react, and how did the British react. Okay, so you have a couple of links here to help you find this information. Okay, that is your other must do before you're ready for your mastery check.